Hey, this is Alex. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how I paint a pair of red bell peppers from life using oil paint. This is what the painting looks like when it's finished. And this video is going to be a little different than my other ones in that I'm actually going to show you the full process, start to finish, in real time, while giving you a little bit of insight into the decisions that I make along the way. So this painting took a little bit over an hour, so grab a coffee or a beer or I don't know, White Claw, I don't know what you kids drink these days, and let's get into it. I guess the first thing I should address is why I'm not painting on a clean white gesso surface, but rather on another painting. This is a painting that I did about 3 years ago, and it didn't come out that good, as you can see. It's really dark, muddy, and overall it just doesn't make me feel anything when I look at it. It's been in a box for the past 3 years, and when I was doing a little bit of inventory, I decided that rather than just tossing it in the trash, I'd go ahead and paint over it. I know it may be a little bit frustrating for some of you not to be able to see the drawing as clearly when it's on another painting like that. But hang in there, once I cover most of the board with paint, it'll all begin to make sense. So the first thing I do is establish where the ground is in this painting. I'm using some burnt umber with ultramarine blue mixed in with a little bit of linseed oil for the initial drawing. I don't really use any mineral spirits or varnish in my medium because I just don't like the fumes. If you have good ventilation, you can use some terpenoid or gum var if you like. That'll make the paint stick a little bit easier to the surface. Okay, once I establish the ground, I begin to put the peppers into that space. It's best not to dwell on details at this stage. You can already see that I'm making a mistake by putting in too much details before I'm completely happy with the position of the peppers in the panel. It looks like both peppers overall are too far to the left, and there is not enough room for me to paint that wonderful little leaf that comes off of the left pepper. Luckily, oil paint erases very easily with a rag or paper towel. And if you notice something wrong at these early stages, you have to correct it. You can fix up the details later on, but to change the composition after you've started applying color is a much bigger job. Okay, that's better. The peppers move over to the right and make more room for the big leaf. Notice how this time I'm just putting down two big circles before working on any of the details. Should have done that from the beginning. Okay, that's feeling a lot better. Things are much more over to the right. There's room for that leaf. Life is good. Okay, so now that the overall shape is right, the overall composition is right, now is the time to go into a few details and kind of establish those shoulders of the pepper and where the stem goes and all that stuff. By the way, did you notice that you're not even noticing the painting underneath anymore? Of course, now that I've said it, you're looking at it, but it's funny how you completely change focus from what was there before to what you're working on now. So once you have your overall shape laid down, you can also begin to block in some overall big shadows or big darks of the painting. And by the way, these peppers, they are from my front garden. I grew them. That's why there's a leaf on one of them. There is a little bit of bug damage on the leaf. I think some slugs got to them. So, but you know, that just gives me a little extra details to paint, which is always fun. So now I'm working on the stem, and I've made a decision to put the leaf actually behind the stem, unlike what I see in the picture. And the reason for that is just that it just felt better to have the kind of the more powerful, thicker stem in front without being obstructed. So I'm just going to draw where that shadow is going to go from the leaf and just work out some more of those details. Okay. And also just block in very quickly some of those drop shadows onto the peppers. And I've mixed in a little bit more ultramarine blue into my onto my brush, and that's because that surface is very kind of has a very cool aqua color, so the shadows can be much cooler than the burnt umber that I was using for the drawing. Alright, enough playing around with the details. Let's get some paint on this painting. There's those slug bites that I was talking about on the leaf. So next I'm going to mix up a little bit of background color. Same thing, burnt umber, ultramarine blue, but this time I'm going to mix up a little bit of white into it just to give it a little more coverage power and lighten it up a little bit. It'll be nice to just get rid of that background, kind of establish that overall tone on which the peppers can sort of shine. It'll also be very pleasant to get rid of that big yellow spot in the upper right corner. Now the way I have this still life set up is that I have a box on the left casting kind of a big shadow, so the background on the left is going to be darker, and then once we move over to the right it kind of transitions gradually to a lighter color, lighter gray. Okay, doesn't that feel good to get rid of that daffodil? Now we can focus on the painting. And while I have this gray color on the brush, I'm just going to hit some of the shadows with it too. It's a good idea to bring your background colors into the foreground and your foreground colors into the background, otherwise things in your paintings just won't harmonize as well. It's also a good idea to redefine your shapes whenever you see that things are beginning to go a little soft. Especially if you've painted over certain lines with your background color. Okay, so I have a base coat on the background. Now I've added some more white and yellow ochre to the mix, and that will be the light part of the background. And the reason why I add yellow is because the white tends to cool down the color and also make it much less saturated, so you need a little bit of something there to bring the color back up. Okay, here comes the fun part. So I'm using almost pure cadmium red here to block in the brightest parts of the pepper. Now usually I would block in the darkest parts of an object first, because it's always easier to paint lighter colors over darker colors. However, in this case, because I already have the dark of the previous painting in the background, I'm not so worried about trying to get things darker. And also this red is kind of notoriously easy to get muddied, so I'm going to lay that down first and then moderate it as needed. This area where the daffodil used to be is kind of thick, so I have to apply a little bit more paint to fight with that yellow. There's also a little bit of impasto left over from the previous painting, which might actually be a nice thing later on when this painting is done. There's going to be a little bit of different texture on that part of the painting. So I'm using this red just as a drawing tool here, where I lay it on thicker where it's brighter, and in the shadow areas I just kind of scumble it and just to rub the brush over those areas and allow some of the dark from the previous painting to shine through and darken up the darker parts of the pepper. And then later I'll adjust those colors, but while my brush is loaded with the darks, with the cadmium, I can just hit those darks and at least have a little bit of color there to start working with. I love working with this red. It's so satisfying to put that down over, especially over a darker surface, because it really glows. I will say that if you are using cadmium red, be careful, because it is a toxic color, so don't put that in your mouth or in your eyes or anything like that, and try not to get it on your skin. So that part where there's a shadow, I've already had a little bit of burnt umber applied, so when I go over it with the red, it naturally gets darker and I don't really have to do a lot more. It's another little benefit of blocking in your shadows first. Yeah, where the pepper is the brightest, I can add more paint, give it a little bit more strength. So now that I see that the shadow needs to be a little bit darker, I've mixed a little bit of burnt sienna and alizarin crimson into the cadmium red to make the shadow. That's probably a little too intense for a shadow, but I'm gonna moderate that later. For the board, I've mixed up some chromium oxide with white, ultramarine blue, and yellow ochre. And I'm going to use that for the shadow part of the board. It's pretty clear that I'm not very good with straight lines. Um, it'll all work out in the end. Yeah, generally, I try not to paint a single solid color, so I'm gonna go into that later and adjust it. In nature, there's never really solid colors. If you look closely, there are always all kinds of light and color variations, even in things that are actually painted solid colors. And so next for the drop shadows under the peppers, I'm going to take that same mixture and just add some more ultramarine blue and burnt umber to darken it up. And then just hit those areas. I'm also painting in a little bit of the background behind the peppers to bring out some of that green. And because I already have some color there, whatever green that I'm using is actually getting mixed in with that, and it's getting darker all on its own. So I don't have to worry too much unless I need to adjust something. So like for example here I went a little too bright, so I'm going to need to pull that down a little bit more. And now that I've put down the shadows on the board, I can see that the peppers need to go darker in the shadows as well. So I've added a little bit of burnt umber to the red that I was already using for the shadows, and starting to block those in a little bit more. This is probably a little too dark, but it'll help define the volume of the peppers, and I can always adjust it later. A lot of times I wind up mixing the paint directly on my painting surface, and not as much on the palette. You can see how easily the red gets suppressed by the darker colors. It doesn't take much. So I'm blocking in the shadows a little bit more and trying to create a little bit more definition between the lights and the darks. And it's definitely a little too dark. So as you're looking at this, as you're watching this, you may think that, oh, this guy's messing up. It's messing up the drawing, messing up the painting. But there's a method to this madness. And with oil paint, it's very easy to adjust things, go back and forth between the darker and the lighter colors. And in my opinion, it's always better to have a little bit more of a securely defined lights and darks first before you go into the details and start refining and fine-tuning the colors. So that's my focus here. At this stage of the painting, there's really no reason to panic when you make a mistake. Really, the focus here is just to get the canvas, or in this case the panel, covered with paint, have a nice base, and then start working on the details after that. And you can already see that if I just add a little bit of red back into that shadow color, it goes back up to something that looks more normal. I'm probably spending a little too much time on the details here. I need to kind of get to the parts of the painting that don't have any paint on them yet. Now it's time to paint the brightest part of the board, and for that I'm using a similar mixture, but this time I'm going to use cadmium yellow instead of yellow ochre, and a lot more white to make that bright part of the board. It's a good time to define the line between the light and shadow and reassert that a little bit more. The straight line, my nemesis. I'll be back for you. We'll get you squared away. There's a little bit of light you can see behind the peppers, behind those shadows. Yeah, that front edge is getting a little fuzzy. I'm gonna have to redefine that later. Since I have a little bit of that light color on the brush, I'm gonna bring a little bit of that into the shadow also, just to vary things up a little bit. And while I'm working with green, I'm going to mix up a more yellow version of that and block out the stems. So now with the chromium green, I've added some more white, some cad yellow, and some yellow ochre, maybe a little bit of burnt sienna to desaturate it a little bit. And I think once again I'm breaking my own rules. I should probably paint the darkest parts first, but again, because I'm working on a darker surface, I can get away with a lot more things, like putting down some of the brightest colors first. Okay, I guess it's time to put in some darks. This time I'm using the same mix pretty much, just with a little bit more burnt umber and ultramarine blue to create those dark areas. And really I should have done that first, probably before I did the lights. It's also kind of more satisfying to paint your lights into the darks. You can use that as a way of defining the shapes and defining the forms. There's a lot of details in that part of the stem. I don't know what you call it. Maybe it's called the crown or something of the pepper. But at this stage, there's no need to go too far into it. A few strokes here and there, and you kind of get a good sense of the overall shape. It's better to just simplify and kind of abstract the shapes. And then the tip there of the pepper has a little bit of it's broken, so you can see inside of the stem, so I'm adding a little bit more white and yellow ochre to kind of bring those colors forward. So I'm going to block in the darks of the leaf, and as I'm putting this down, I can tell it's probably a little bit too bright and not dark enough to define the shape, but I just want to have some color there, just a little base. Can always adjust it and push and pull as I go along. And I'm going to use some white with cad yellow and hit those highlights. It's really the highlights that give the most definition to the forms, in my opinion. That's when things begin to really take volume and shape. And I'm drawing the veins in the leaf because they really pick up that light very well. Going back in with a little bit of darks to push some of those forms back away from the light. Now it looks like I messed up the leaf a little bit. That's alright. Can always go back in with the background color and redefine the outlines a little bit more. I think I had that light color there on the brush. So you can just come back in from the edges and tighten up the shape. And actually, while I have the brush with the gray on it, I might as well cool off some of the shadows under the peppers. And in the peppers themselves. Remember what I said about bringing the background colors into the foreground and vice versa. I really haven't brought any reds into that gray background, but by bringing the grays into the peppers, I'm creating a little bit more of a balance and harmony. And I'm going to bring in a lot more cool colors into the peppers later on too. Alright, let's define the shadows on the board a little bit more. It's looking a little flat and boring. Just going to add a bit of that shadow color along the edge and to define that a little bit more, and also create a little bit of interest as the along the edge there. And as you can see, I'm not very methodical about how I paint. Sometimes if I see something on the painting and it just bothers me, I'll go ahead and touch it with a brush, and sometimes it's not the right color, but it's better to do something about it when you see it than just to ignore it. So now the entire painting is covered with paint. Those daffodils are a distant memory, and we can focus on the peppers at hand. It's a good time at this point to squint and see how you're doing so far. You can reassert the forms, make adjustments to the drawing, and if there are any nooks and crannies that didn't get painted, now is the time to make sure they do. From here until the end, I'm going to be making adjustments that may seem very minor, but it's really those minor details and little adjustments that take a painting from a bit of a mess as what it is right now to something that is kind of pleasant to look at and has subtlety and has details that are interesting to take in. It's time to look at the big blocks of color and look for variations in lighting. As the form turns, it begins to catch and reflect light in different ways. And the more of those details you notice and put down in your painting, the more realistic the painting will look. You can see that this front plane, as it goes down, it becomes darker, but it does it gradually. So it's still the light part, but it sort of begins to turn to a halftone. And you can already see how it becomes a little bit more volumetric just from those little adjustments. A lot of times a painting is similar to a sculpture where you sort of build up the layers to create volume. So as I'm going through, I'm continually adding more and more paint to the brighter parts of the pepper to make it feel like it's coming forward. I'm also looking for places where light and shadow meet and try to better define them, better define that edge. Where the shapes are facing the light directly, they will be the brightest and gradually darken as they turn away. So the more of that kind of transition that you show, the more realistic it'll look. And And sometimes there's just a little bit of light that catches on a certain part, and it's much darker than the rest of the object. And then the shadows, they also have a lot of detail that you begin to notice if you look closely. There are variations in how the dark things are, and also the all-important reflected light, which in this case is the green of the surface that the peppers are sitting on. So I've taken a little bit of that same green that I used for the shadow color of the board, and I'm just beginning to paint in some of those reflected lights. And when you first see it, it kind of looks weird. Um, and looks kind of wrong, but it begins to make sense as you add more and more of the reflected light and mix it in with the shadow color of the pepper. And the other thing that helps is consistency between what planes are being hit by that reflection. So if you only had a smudge of green on that pepper, it'll look weird, but once you add the green to all the parts that are facing the board and would logically reflect back into you, towards the viewer, suddenly things begin to make sense, and your eyes kind of adjust and they realize that's what it's supposed to be, is the reflection. Now that's clearly too bright, so I'm gonna need to push that down a little bit. Let's just bring some more of that red shadow color back in to temper the green. Although I'm going to allow some of the pure green to remain for drama. Notice how when you look at the peppers now, the green really makes sense and it doesn't look weird anymore. And that is because of consistency of how the reflections bounce off the surfaces that are facing the board. Now there are a few places in the pepper, in the shadow of the pepper, where light actually passes through the pepper and creates this intense translucent red on the other side, and I'm going to try to capture a little bit of that by using a color that's not quite as bright as the highlight color, but that it probably needs to be a little bit cooler, but still a very intense color. Around the stem, I want to define that sort of the outline a little bit. So I'm just going to use a little bit of dark red and just draw that in, and also kind of hide any remaining bits of that daffodil that is still showing through. That's better. This little dip in this part of the pepper is a little tricky to paint, and I can understand what the shape is. However, the way that the light bounces off the pepper, it's kind of it's a little hard to capture. So what I'm gonna do is just try to copy as much as I can what I'm seeing and hope that it looks right. There's a little bit of that green reflected in the cast shadow as well. It's not quite as intense as this, but so I'm gonna just push that down, but it's definitely there's some of it is there. I noticed that the reflected light is actually a little bit more blue, so I'm just gonna hit those areas with a little bit of ultramarine blue with white to cool them down some more. In this photo, the surface looks much more gray, and so the reflections on the pepper are much more subdued, but the eyes tend to see more than the camera, which is why I prefer painting from life always. Few more adjustments to the reflected lights. And also the overall shape. Alright, so this next part is my favorite. I'm gonna work on putting in the highlights on the pepper. So I'm just using pure titanium white to create that little spark of light on the surface. And I try to put it down as pure as possible first, and then I can always go in and modify the edge of it a little bit to make it feel more natural. This is really when the shapes begin to materialize and take form. And I do this towards the end because really once you put down those highlights, there's not a lot you can do to the light parts of your object unless you scrape off the highlights and start over. Now the way the light reflects on those highlights is it's kind of interesting because it's not just the highest parts of the pepper, but also the little folds. They also catch a little bit of light, which is important to get. So that highlight on the left pepper is a little too bright, so I'm gonna just kind of work on the edge a little bit and soften it, but not so much that it goes away. Now I'm gonna work a little bit on the greenery some more. I'm mixing up some white with cadmium yellow to hit the highlights of the stem and the leaf. Again, the highlights is when things begin to kind of pop and come forward. I also want to bring a little bit of that yellow into the shadow of the board, and because the shadow feels a little warmer. I think it's because it's reflecting some of the objects in front of it, which is like the more brown board that it's sitting on. And while I'm at it, I'm gonna try to straighten out that front edge of the board a little bit. Those damn straight lines. I'm gonna bring a little bit of red into the shadow as well. Remember how I said it's good to bring some of the background colors into the foreground and vice versa? This will also help to harmonize the things a little bit. Let's also brighten up the top of the surface a little bit. And straighten that edge some more. Look at that. That's almost straight, right? Now as the cast shadow falls further from the object, the edge begins to soften and feather out. And you can just use a brush that doesn't have a lot of paint on it. Either a light color brush or a dark color brush, and just work that edge a little bit and it'll soften. I'm also seeing a little bit of light falling on the board behind the peppers. That should help to create a little bit more interest and depth in the picture. Now just look at those peppers. Look at how shiny they are. And look how bright they look. And part of the reason why they're so bright is because of this green board and the green leaf. That's green and red are complementary colors, and when you put them next to each other, they tend to do each other favors, making each other look brighter. So it doesn't take much, and in this case, the colors are actually quite contrasting. Now I'm adding a little bit more detail to the front part of the wood. It's looking a little soft, and I'm using the color that's somewhere between the cast shadow color and the base color of the front plane of the board. And I'm also adding a little bit of detail and texture to the top. While I'm at it, I did notice a few dings in that straight part of the front face of the board, so I'm going to put those in. First, I'll bring in a little bit of the shadow color into the highlight and create basically a little blotch, and then I'll put a little bit of light on the other side, and kind of immediately begins to look like a ding. Let's touch up those shadows a little bit more, just defining those shapes, working out the edges. That part seemed a little much softer than what I had it. I also noticed some detail is missing in the shadows of the peppers. Since I have all the colors already mixed on the palette, it's really easy to just go back and make some adjustments. There was a little bit of a space between the reflected light of the top part and the little sliver in the crevice of the pepper. Whoops, picked up some of that yellow from the stem. It's not a big deal. Just gonna go over it with some more of the shadow red. I think it actually gonna work out just fine. It looks like a bit of reflected light there from the pepper on the left. Few more touch-ups on this pepper. This big cast shadow feels a little too simple. You can see that there's a little bit of reflected green in it, which helps give it some more volume. There's also a bit more variety in the shadow itself. There are places that catch the light a little bit more than others. And all these details help define the form and make things look more three-dimensional. It's time to polish the greenery up a little bit more. And this stem, use a little bit of highlight, and there was this space, dark space between the pepper and the stem that I need to close up. Okay. I'm using some of the background color to help refine the edge of the drawing. Also, if there are any edges that still have the old painting showing through, I'm filling those in with the background color. And the gray happens to be just the right color to pump up those cast shadows under the peppers as well. Alright, back to the leaf stem. I'm going to add a highlight to it, which should solidify it a little bit more. That's looking pretty good. And while I'm at it, let's define the leaf a little bit more with the highlights. Now I could probably go into a lot more detail on the leaf and maybe even get a thinner brush and work out all the forms and all the shapes and all the highlights and shadow detail, but I'm trying to keep this painting fairly loose. And because once you start getting into details in one area, you gotta go into the details everywhere else. And I really like the freshness of a painting that still has some brushwork and some looseness to it. So this stem needs a bit more clarity too. There's a cast shadow that comes off the stem, which is not very clear in my painting. So I'm going to clarify that using the lights and darks that I have been using and just copy what I see. That's better. Looks like it's sticking out. So I think this painting is almost finished. What did you think? If you stayed this long, I would appreciate you giving this video a like. And if this video was helpful, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If you have any suggestions, feel free to voice those as well. I made this video in the hopes that it would be helpful for some people. But the reality is that my first priority is the painting and not the video. When I set up the camera, I try to make sure it doesn't get in the way of my painting. So in my next video, I'm going to record the palette as well, so you can see what colors I'm mixing. So hopefully that'll be even more helpful. But anyway, I'd love to hear from you guys. Let me know what you think. Let me know if this kind of longer format is something that you're interested in and something that you want to see more of. If you want to see more of my work, please check out my YouTube channel. Subscribe. I'll be posting more videos. I have a lot more other videos as well of my paintings. And follow me on Instagram. It's at LXNYC. I try to post things there very regularly. I also have an Etsy shop where this painting is currently available, along with other paintings of mine. There is a link in the description, so click that and go check that out. I'd love one day to be able to just paint and not have to work. So if you guys buy my paintings, that can be possible. Alright, so there are just a few little touch-ups that I'm going to do to this painting before I call it finished. It's nice to kind of hit those edges between things and soften them as they are going back in space. So the further you are in space, the softer the edge will be between the background and the foreground. And yeah, I think it's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with this one. I'm gonna sign it AV 2019. And with that, I'm gonna call this one finished. Thanks so much for watching. Please check out my other videos. I have videos of painting glass, metal, or liquids, especially whiskey, flowers, berries, papaya. I even painted a live lobster and posted a video of that. So definitely check it out. Until next time.